Hey there, and welcome back to Bedtime Survivalist, where history gets quiet enough to fall asleep to. Tonight we're leaving dry land behind entirely. No castles, no cottages, no warm hearths. Tonight we're climbing aboard a wooden ship, somewhere in the middle of a cold, black ocean, as the wind starts to rise and the first waves begin to slap hard against the hull. Before we cast off, if you're the kind of person who likes drifting asleep to slow, detailed history, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this one. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right now, wherever you are, because somehow it's always the middle of the night somewhere when this channel is playing. Now, dim the lights, pull the blanket up over your shoulders the way a sailor might pull a wool coat tight against the wind, and let's ask the question that brought us out here in the first place. Have you ever wondered how pirates slept? Not the pirates of storybooks with eye patches and treasure maps and parrots perched dramatically on their shoulders, but real sailors on real wooden ships, trying to close their eyes while the ocean tried its very best to keep them awake. How does anyone rest with freezing spray coming over the rail? How does a body find sleep when the whole world is tilting, creaking, and occasionally trying to throw you out of bed? What did it feel like to lie in the dark, below the waterline, listening to a storm scream through the rigging above your head, and somehow still drift off? Tonight, we find out. Let's step aboard. Picture the ship not as a toy on a map, but as it actually was, a floating village of timber, tar and rope, groaning under its own weight, carrying somewhere between 60 and 200 souls across an ocean that did not care whether any of them made it to the other side. This was the world a pirate crew called home. Not a home with walls that stayed still, not a home with a floor you could trust from 1 hour to the next, a home that rocked, dipped, climbed, and shuddered with every single wave, day and night, for weeks or months at a stretch, with land nothing more than a rumour somewhere over the horizon. To understand how pirates slept, you first have to understand what kind of world they were sleeping in, because it was a world unlike almost anything a person could experience today. The ships themselves, whether captured merchant vessels, converted naval ships, or smaller sloops built for speed, were essentially wooden shells stretched taut over a skeleton of oak ribs, sealed with tar and hope, and trusted to hold back an entire ocean. Every plank had been fitted by hand. Every seam had been packed with fibrous oakum and sealed with pitch, a process called caulking, which had to be checked and repaired constantly because wood swells, wood shrinks, wood cracks, and the sea finds every single weakness eventually. Life aboard such a ship was, by nature, a life of close quarters. There was no getting away from anyone. There was no private room to retreat to, no closed door to shut out the noise of other people breathing, snoring, coughing, or arguing about whose turn it was for the good spot near the stove. A pirate crew was in a very real sense forced into a kind of accidental intimacy, sharing not just their labour but their food, their fears, their jokes, and eventually their exhaustion. Now, here's something that often surprises people. Pirate ships, despite their fearsome reputation, were frequently more democratic than the naval vessels they were feared for attacking. Many pirate crews operated under a set of agreed-upon rules, sometimes called the ship's articles, which crew members would actually sign or mark before a voyage began. These articles could cover everything from the division of stolen goods to compensation for injuries suffered in battle, and in many crews, the captain himself could be voted out if the crew lost confidence in him. This wasn't chaos. It was, in its own rough way, a kind of self-governance, born out of necessity, where trust between crewmates mattered more than rank, because out on the open ocean, rank alone could not keep a ship afloat. Only cooperation could do that. This mattered enormously when it came to sleep, because a crew that trusted each other, however uneasily, could actually rest. You cannot close your eyes in a room full of people you fear will slit your throat in the dark. Pirate ships worked, when they worked at all, because there was an unspoken agreement that below deck, in the dark, in the crowded space where everyone lay tangled together, a kind of truce existed. The violence of raiding and boarding stayed above, on the water, aimed outward at the world. Below deck was, in theory, meant to be safe. Of course, theory and reality did not always agree, and shipboard tensions could and did boil over. But for the purposes of tonight's slow journey into the past, let's imagine a crew that has settled into its rhythm, a crew that has sailed together long enough to know each other's coughs in the dark, long enough to recognize footsteps on the deck above, without needing to look. The ship itself was divided into a strict hierarchy of space, even if the crew's social structure was more equal than most people assume. At the stern, toward the back, sat the captain's quarters, usually the only truly private space on the entire vessel, small as it was. Moving forward, you would find the quartermaster's space, storage holds packed with supplies, cannon and shot, secured against the rolling of the sea. And finally, deep in the belly of the ship, the crew's quarters, low-ceilinged, dim, and packed edge to edge with men trying to find rest. The air down there was thick, thick with the smell of tar used to seal the hull, thick with salt and damp wool, thick with the smoke of tallow candles and the general undeniable smell of dozens of unwashed bodies living in close proximity for months on end. Fresh water was precious and rationed carefully, which meant bathing was, at best, an occasional luxury rather than a daily habit. And yet somehow, in this cramped, dim, salt-soaked world, sailors slept. Night after night, storm after storm, they found their way into rest, because the alternative, staying awake and afraid every single night for months at sea, simply was not something the human body could sustain. As the sun began to sink over the water each evening, the rhythm of the ship would begin to shift. The bright chaos of daytime work, hauling rope, adjusting sails, scrubbing decks, would slowly give way to something quieter. Lanterns would be lit and carefully secured against the ship's constant motion, because an unsecured flame on a wooden ship was a threat far more immediate than any storm. Meals, usually simple, salted, and monotonous, would be served, and the crew not currently on duty would begin drifting, quite literally, toward the hatches that led below. And it was there, descending into the dim, creaking dark of the lower deck, that the real story of pirate sleep truly begins. Because waiting for them below wasn't a bed in any sense we would recognize today. It was something stranger, something cleverer, something that had been quietly solving the problem of sleeping at sea for centuries before any of these sailors were even born. Climbing down into the lower decks of a pirate ship was, in every sense, like stepping into another world entirely. Above, on deck, There was at least the open sky, however stormy, however cold. There was a horizon to look at, air to breathe freely, and some sense of scale. Below, there was none of that. The ceilings on most ships of this era stood barely 5.5 feet high, sometimes less, which meant that anyone of average height, let alone the taller members of a crew, spent their entire time below deck slightly hunched, moving carefully to avoid cracking their heads against the low, wooden beams overhead. The lower deck was where most of the crew lived their lives when they weren't working. It served as sleeping quarters, dining hall, and general gathering space all at once, because there simply wasn't enough room on the ship to dedicate separate spaces to separate purposes. Everything happened in the same dim, low space, lit only by the flicker of a few carefully secured lanterns, because open flame was rationed as carefully as fresh water, given how catastrophic a fire could be on a ship made almost entirely of wood, tar, and rope. The first thing that struck anyone descending into this space beyond the low ceiling was the smell. It's worth lingering on this for a moment because it tells you something real about the experience, not just a curiosity, but a fact of daily life. The air below deck carried the thick scent of tar, which had been used to seal the wooden hull against the sea. It carried salt, brought in by wet clothing and damp rope. It carried the smell of bilge water, the foul, stagnant water that collected in the lowest part of the ship's hull, a mixture of seawater, spilled cargo, and whatever else had found its way down there, which needed to be pumped out regularly but never entirely disappeared. And of course, it carried the smell of dozens of bodies living, working, and sleeping in close proximity for weeks or months without regular access to fresh water for washing. Modern sensibilities recoil from this description, and understandably so. But it's worth remembering that everyone aboard lived within the same conditions, which meant that after a certain point, the smell simply became the background of life, noticed by newcomers and utterly ignored by everyone who had been aboard more than a few weeks. The human nose, it turns out, adjusts to almost anything given enough time, which is either a comforting thought or a slightly unsettling one, depending on how you look at it. Beyond the smell, the lower deck was dominated by cargo, cannon, and the crew's meagre possessions. Sea chests, sturdy wooden boxes used to store a sailor's few belongings, clothing, tools, perhaps a small trinket from home, were often the only personal space a pirate could claim on the entire ship. These chests doubled as seats, tables, and sometimes even makeshift barriers wedged into place to keep from sliding across the deck during rough seas. Everything on a ship had to be secured, tied down, or otherwise accounted for, because an unsecured object on a rolling ship became, very quickly, a dangerous projectile. Ventilation, or the near total lack of it, was another defining feature of life below deck. There were no windows in the modern sense, only small hatches and occasionally tiny portholes, which were often sealed shut entirely during storms to keep seawater from flooding in. This meant that on calm nights the air below deck could grow warm and stagnant, thick with the heat of packed bodies. On stormy nights with hatches battened down against the weather, it could grow even worse, trapping heat, moisture, and smell together in a way that made simply breathing feel like a small chore. And yet, this same enclosed space that felt so oppressive in some ways offered something crucial in others. protection. Down here below the waterline, sailors were shielded from the worst of a storm's fury. The wind couldn't reach them. The freezing spray couldn't reach them. Whatever chaos was happening above on the open deck stayed largely above, and that separation, however cramped and smelly it might have been, was often the difference between a survivable night and a genuinely dangerous one. Temperature was a constant, quiet battle, especially on voyages through colder waters or during winter crossings. Wood, it turns out, is not a particularly good insulator, and a ship's hull, no matter how well built, could not keep out the deep chill of the open ocean, especially at night when the surrounding water temperature dropped and the wind picked up. Sailors combated this the only way they could, through layering. Wool clothing, thick and often damp, despite their best efforts, became the primary defense against the cold. Blankets, when available, were treasured possessions, sometimes shared between crew members who had grown close enough to trust one another with such an intimate arrangement. And bodies themselves became a source of warmth, crew members packed closely enough together that shared heat became a genuine practical strategy for surviving a cold night at sea. Whether anyone admitted to appreciating it or not, it's worth pausing here to imagine the sound of this space at night, because sound, more than almost anything else, defines what it must have felt like to try to sleep in such conditions. The creak of timber, constant, almost musical in its rhythm, as the ship's frame flexed and adjusted to the movement of the water beneath it. The distant crash of waves against the hull, muffled by the wood, but never entirely silenced. The snoring, coughing, and shifting of dozens of bodies crammed into close quarters. The occasional footsteps of the watch crew moving overhead, their boots echoing faintly through the deck boards. This was the soundtrack of rest aboard a pirate ship, a strange layered symphony of wood and water and human breath. And somehow, within all of that noise, sailors found their way into sleep. But before we can talk about how they actually managed that trick, we need to talk about the single most important piece of sleeping equipment ever adopted by sailors in the age of sail, a simple invention that changed shipboard life more than almost anything else, and one that came from a place most people wouldn't expect. If there's one object that made sleep at sea genuinely possible rather than merely survivable, it's the hammock. And the story of how the hammock came to define sailing life is, in its own quiet way, one of the great overlooked innovations in maritime history. A small piece of woven fabric that solved a problem sailors had been struggling with for centuries. The hammock did not originate in Europe. It was adopted from indigenous peoples of the Caribbean who had been using suspended woven beds for generations before European sailors ever encountered them during their voyages across the Atlantic. These early hammocks, typically woven from the fibers of the hammock tree or later from cotton and other available materials, offered something no European sleeping arrangement had ever quite managed. A bed that moved with its surroundings rather than fighting against them. This might sound like a small distinction, but aboard a ship it made all the difference in the world. Think about what happens when you try to sleep on a fixed surface, a wooden bunk or a simple pallet on the floor, while the ship beneath you rolls and pitches with the motion of the waves. Every shift of the vessel becomes a jolt to your body. You're thrown gently, or not so gently, from side to side, your body fighting a constant low-grade battle against gravity and momentum all night long. It's exhausting, even if you never fully wake up from it. The body registers every small impact, every sudden shift, and true, deep rest becomes almost impossible. The hammocks solve this problem elegantly, almost effortlessly. Suspended from ropes attached to the overhead beams, a hammock swings freely with the motion of the ship rather than resisting it. When the vessel rolls to one side, the hammock simply swings along with it, keeping the sleeper's body in a relatively stable, cushioned position throughout the movement. Instead of being thrown around by the ship's motion, sailors sleeping in hammocks were gently rocked by it, the same motion that made a fixed bed miserable becoming in a hammock, something closer to a slow, rhythmic lullaby. This effect became especially valuable during rough weather. On a night when the sea churned and the ship pitched dramatically from wave to wave, a sailor lying in a fixed bunk might find themselves nearly thrown from their bed entirely, gripping the edges just to stay in place. But a sailor in a hammock, swinging gently with each roll of the ship, could often continue sleeping through conditions that would have made a fixed bed genuinely dangerous. There's something almost poetic about this, the idea that the very thing making the sea so frightening, its constant motion, its refusal to hold still, became, through the simple genius of a suspended bed, something that could actually rock a person to sleep rather than keep them awake. There were practical benefits too, beyond simple comfort. Hammocks took up a fraction of the space required by fixed bunks, which mattered enormously on a ship where every inch of space had to be carefully allocated between crew quarters, cargo, weaponry, and supplies. During the day, hammocks could be taken down entirely, rolled up and stowed away, freeing the lower deck for other uses, whether that meant meals, repairs, or simply more room to move. This flexibility made hammocks not just comfortable but genuinely practical for the cramped realities of shipboard life. Hammocks also kept sailors off the deck itself, which mattered more than it might initially seem. The lower decks of a ship were frequently damp, whether from seawater seeping through imperfect seals in the hull, condensation building up in the cold, poorly ventilated space, or simply the general moisture that clung to everything aboard a wooden ship at sea. Sleeping directly on the deck meant sleeping in that dampness night after night, which contributed to illness, joint pain, and general discomfort over the course of a long voyage. A hammock, suspended above the deck, kept sailors elevated, dry, and somewhat insulated from the cold, damp wood beneath them, a small but meaningful improvement to their nightly comfort and long-term health. Rigging a hammock correctly was itself a small skill that every sailor eventually mastered, whether they wanted to or not. The ropes needed to be tied at the correct tension, not so tight that the hammock became rigid and uncomfortable, but not so loose that it swung too wildly during rough weather. Sailors learned to angle their bodies diagonally within the hammock's fabric, a technique that actually produced a flatter, more comfortable sleeping surface than lying straight along its length. Something hammock users still practice today, whether or not they realize they're echoing a centuries-old sailor's trick. Space between hammocks was minimal, often as little as 14 inches separating one sleeping sailor from the next. An arrangement that left absolutely no room for privacy and very little room for personal space of any kind. Crew members slept practically shoulder to shoulder, their hammocks swaying in unison with the movement of the ship, a strange shared rhythm that bound the entire crew together in sleep, even as it stripped away any illusion of solitude. There was an intimacy to it, an enforced closeness that most modern people would find deeply uncomfortable, but which, for sailors who had grown accustomed to shipboard life, simply became another unremarkable part of their nightly routine. And so, night after night in ships crossing cold, dark, unpredictable waters, this simple woven bed, borrowed from a culture entirely unfamiliar to the European sailors who adopted it, became the single most important tool for making sleep at sea not just possible, but genuinely restful. It's a small, quiet piece of history, easy to overlook in favour of more dramatic pirate imagery, treasure and cannon fire and daring escapes. But without the hammock, none of those dramatic moments would have been sustainable, because a crew that couldn't sleep, couldn't sail, couldn't fight, and couldn't survive the long, grinding reality of life at sea. But sleep, even in the gentle sway of a well-rigged hammock, was never guaranteed to last uninterrupted through the night, because the ship itself never truly slept. And that brings us to one of the strangest, most demanding rhythms of shipboard life, the watch. There is a peculiar truth about life at sea that separates it from almost every other kind of human experience, and it's this. A ship, unlike a house or a village or a city, cannot simply close its eyes for the night. The ocean does not pause its dangers between sunset and sunrise. Storms do not check the time before rolling in. Other ships, whether friendly, hostile, or entirely unknown, do not announce their presence during daylight hours out of courtesy. And so, for as long as a vessel remained at sea, someone, always, had to be awake. This necessity gave rise to the watch system, a structured rotation of duty that governed the sleeping and waking hours of every sailor aboard, whether they served on a naval vessel, a merchant ship, or a pirate crew. The watch system divided the 24-hour day into a series of shifts, traditionally 4 hours each, during which a portion of the crew remained on duty, managing the sails, watching the horizon, steering the ship, and responding to whatever the sea decided to throw at them, while the rest of the crew attempted to rest below deck. The exact structure of watches could vary somewhat between different crews and different eras, but the general principle remained remarkably consistent across the age of sail. A typical arrangement might divide the crew into two main watches, often called the starboard watch and the larboard watch, named for the sides of the ship, each responsible for alternating 4-hour shifts throughout the day and night. This meant that over the course of a full day, a sailor might work 2 shifts of 4 hours each, separated by periods of rest, though the exact timing shifted depending on which watch a sailor belonged to and how the schedule had been arranged for that particular voyage. One especially clever adjustment built into many watch systems was something called the dog watch, a pair of shorter 2-hour shifts inserted into the early evening hours, typically between 4 and 8 in the evening. This shorter split served a crucial purpose beyond simply breaking up the monotony of the schedule. By dividing this period into 2 shorter watches instead of one standard 4-hour shift, the total number of watches in a full day became an odd number rather than an even one. This meant that a sailor who worked the first watch one night would find themselves working a different watch the following night, and the schedule would continue rotating in this way, ensuring that no single group of sailors was permanently stuck with the worst overnight hours, night after night, for the entire voyage. It was, in its own small way, a remarkably fair piece of scheduling, born not out of any particular kindness, but out of simple practical necessity, since a crew that felt perpetually cheated by an unfair schedule was far more likely to grow resentful, exhausted, and dangerously careless. For the sailors themselves, this meant that a full night's uninterrupted sleep, the kind most people today take entirely for granted, simply did not exist during a voyage. Instead, rest came in broken pieces, 4 hours here, perhaps another stretch there, constantly interrupted by the need to rise, dress in whatever warm clothing could be found, and climb up into the cold night air to take one's turn on deck. Being woken for a watch, particularly in the deep, freezing hours of the middle of the night, was an experience every sailor came to know intimately. The transition from the relative warmth and shelter of a hammock below deck to the biting wind and spray of an open deck at 2 or 3 in the morning was, by every account, a genuinely difficult adjustment, one that never fully stopped being unpleasant, no matter how many times a sailor experienced it. And yet, there is something worth noting here about how the human body and mind adapt to conditions that would seem, from the outside, entirely unsustainable. Sailors who spent months or years living under this fragmented sleep schedule did not, generally speaking, collapse from exhaustion or lose the ability to function. Instead, something closer to a rhythm developed, an internal adjustment to the ship's demands. The body learned to fall asleep quickly, efficiently, without the luxury of tossing and turning that a modern person might indulge in a comfortable bed at home. Every moment of available rest became precious, and sailors learned, out of necessity, to make full use of it the instant it became available. There's a kind of meditative quality to this adaptation worth sitting with for a moment. Modern sleep science often emphasizes the importance of consistent, uninterrupted rest, and rightly so, for most circumstances. But the sailors of the age of sail lived, by necessity, within an entirely different relationship to sleep, one governed not by personal preference, but by the unwavering demands of the ship and the sea. And within that demanding structure, they still found rest. Not perfect rest, not the deep, unbroken sleep we might wish for ourselves, but enough rest, distributed across broken pieces of the night to keep a body functioning, a mind alert enough to respond to danger, and a crew capable of sailing on, day after day, week after week, for as long as the voyage required. The watch itself, once a sailor climbed up into the night air, was rarely an idle task. Standing watch meant scanning the horizon for other vessels, monitoring the trim of the sails and adjusting them as wind conditions shifted, checking the ship's heading against the stars or a compass, and remaining alert to any sudden change in the weather, a shift in wind direction, a drop in temperature, a strange stillness in the air that experienced sailors learned to recognize as the quiet warning sign of an approaching storm. This last responsibility, watching for the earliest signs of foul weather, carried enormous weight, because on a wooden ship far from any shore, the difference between a crew that spotted a storm early and one that didn't could be the difference between a difficult night and a genuine catastrophe. And it's here, in the quiet, cold hours of a watch shift, eyes scanning a dark and restless horizon, that we begin to move toward the heart of tonight's story. What happened? when the weather sailors feared most finally arrived, and an entire crew, some resting in their hammocks and some standing watch in the freezing wind, had to face a storm together, in the middle of the open ocean with nothing but wood, rope, and each other standing between them and the sea. There is a particular quality to the air before a storm arrives at sea, something experienced sailors learn to recognize almost instinctively, long before modern instruments existed to confirm what their senses were already telling them: a subtle drop in temperature, a stillness that felt somehow wrong, too calm, too heavy, as though the ocean itself were holding its breath, a shift in the colour of the sky along the horizon, clouds gathering with a particular darkness that seasoned sailors learned to read the way a person today might glance at a weather app, except with far higher stakes attached to getting it wrong. When these signs appeared, the entire rhythm of the ship would shift almost immediately. Whatever routine had governed the previous hours, whether crew members were resting below deck or going about their assigned tasks, gave way to a different, more urgent kind of activity: storm preparation. This was not a task left to chance or improvisation. Preparing a wooden sailing ship for rough weather followed a fairly consistent set of procedures, refined over generations of hard-earned experience, because a ship caught unprepared in a genuine storm faced a very real risk of catastrophic damage, or worse. The first priority was almost always the sails. Depending on the severity of the approaching weather, the crew would begin reducing the amount of canvas exposed to the wind, a process involving climbing up into the rigging often high above the deck, and physically gathering and securing portions of the sails to reduce their surface area. This might sound like a simple adjustment, but performed in worsening wind and increasingly rough seas, it was genuinely dangerous work, requiring sailors to balance on narrow foot ropes strung beneath the yards, high above a deck that was itself pitching and rolling beneath them, all while battling increasingly strong gusts of wind that threatened to knock them loose entirely. In severe storms, sails might be reduced dramatically, sometimes down to just a small amount of canvas, enough to maintain some control over the ship's direction without giving the wind enough surface area to overwhelm the vessel entirely. Below deck, meanwhile, an equally important process was underway, securing everything that could possibly move: cargo, supplies, cannon, personal belongings, anything not permanently fixed in place needed to be lashed down, wedged tight, or otherwise secured against the violent rolling and pitching that was about to begin. An unsecured object on a ship in rough seas becomes very quickly a genuine hazard, capable of sliding across the deck with tremendous force, injuring crew members or damaging the ship itself. Sailors who had lived through previous storms knew this lesson intimately, often having witnessed firsthand what happened when preparation was rushed or incomplete. Hatches leading below deck would be sealed as tightly as possible, battened down against the risk of seawater flooding into the lower decks, a genuine danger during severe weather, when waves might wash entirely across the ship's open deck. This sealing process, while necessary for safety, came with its own cost. It meant that fresh air, already limited below deck under normal conditions, became even more scarce during a storm, trapping the crew in an increasingly warm, stagnant, and often frightening environment while the world outside raged. And then, once every possible preparation had been completed, there was nothing left to do but endure. For the sailors resting below deck during a storm, the experience was unlike almost anything else in ordinary human life. The ship's motion, always present at sea, intensified dramatically, the vessel pitching forward and backward, rolling side to side, sometimes dropping suddenly as it crested a wave and fell into the trough beyond it, a sensation sailors described as the ship briefly falling out from beneath them before slamming back down into the water. The sound during these moments was overwhelming. The roar of wind tearing through the rigging above, a high, howling noise unlike anything heard on land. The repeated, thunderous crash of waves striking the hull, sometimes hard enough to be felt as a physical shock through the entire structure of the ship. And beneath it all, the constant groaning protest of the timber itself, flexing and creaking under stresses far beyond what it experienced during calmer weather. And yet, remarkably, this is exactly the moment when the earlier innovation of the hammock proved its true worth. Remember that a hammock, suspended and free to swing, moves with the ship rather than against it. During a violent storm, when a sailor in a fixed bunk might have been thrown bodily from side to side with every roll of the vessel, a sailor in a hammock experienced something closer to being gently, if dramatically, rocked. The hammock would swing with each pitch and roll, the sailor's body cradled within its fabric, absorbing much of the ship's violent motion rather than being subjected to it directly. It's genuinely remarkable when you consider it that the very object designed simply to solve a spacing and comfort problem also happened to provide crucial protection during exactly the moments when protection mattered most. This isn't to say that sleep during a genuine storm was easy, or even particularly restful in the traditional sense. Many sailors describe storms as periods of broken, anxious rest rather than deep sleep, lying awake in their swinging hammocks, listening to the chaos above and around them, trusting in the ship's construction and their captain's skill, even as every instinct urged wakefulness and vigilance. But there is something worth noting in the way experienced crews described these nights, once they had survived enough of them to develop a certain hardened familiarity with the experience. The sounds that might terrify a newcomer, the howling wind, the crashing waves, the groaning timber, became, for veteran sailors, almost a kind of familiar, if unwelcome, lullaby. Not peaceful exactly, but known, predictable in their unpredictability. A storm sailors had weathered before in ships that had proven themselves seaworthy before became something closer to an ordeal to be endured rather than a mystery to be feared, and there was too a strange comfort in numbers, in the simple fact of not facing the storm alone. Packed together in the swaying dark of the lower deck, dozens of sailors rowed out these nights together, their hammocks swinging in an unsynchronized rhythm all around each other, each person keenly aware of the presence of everyone else nearby. There was something steadying in that shared vulnerability, in knowing that whatever the sea decided to do that night, no one aboard was facing it entirely alone. As dawn began to break after such a night and the worst of the storm's fury gradually softened into calmer seas and gentler winds, the crew would slowly emerge from below deck to assess the damage, repair whatever needed repairing, and return gradually to the ordinary rhythms of shipboard life. But that transition from chaos back to calm and everything the crew did in between to hold on to small comforts even in the roughest conditions is a story that deserves its own careful, unhurried telling. One will continue as this quiet night drifts on. Architected remaining chapters exploring maritime comfort, camaraderie, superstitions, and cyclical narrative closure. Architected remaining chapters exploring maritime comfort, camaraderie, superstitions, and cyclical narrative closure. Continuing on into the quieter hours after the worst of the weather has passed, and into the small rituals that made shipboard life bearable night after night. After a storm has passed, or even on an ordinary cold night, when the sea is merely restless rather than truly dangerous, there is a particular kind of comfort that becomes disproportionately important aboard a ship. When almost everything about daily life is difficult, damp, and uncertain, the smallest pleasures take on an outsized significance, and pirate crews, much like sailors of every era, learn to treasure these small mercies with a devotion that might seem, to modern eyes, almost touching in its simplicity. Lantern light was one such comfort, modest as it sounds. Below deck, where daylight never truly reached and where open flame had to be carefully managed given the very real danger of fire aboard a wooden vessel, a few securely mounted lanterns provided the only illumination available once the sun went down. These lanterns burned whale oil or tallow, producing a warm, flickering, imperfect light that cast long shadows across the low beams and crowded hammocks of the lower deck. It was not bright light, not by any modern standard, but it was enough. Enough to see a companion's face across the narrow space. Enough to mend a torn shirt or check a wound. Enough, simply, to hold back the total darkness that would otherwise have filled the space entirely. And there is something in human nature that finds genuine comfort in even a small, steady flame. Against the dark, a comfort that has apparently changed very little across the centuries separating those sailors from us. Warmth, too, took on an outsized importance during cold crossings, and sailors found it wherever they reasonably could. The galley, the ship's kitchen, doubled as an unofficial gathering point during particularly cold stretches of a voyage, since it was often the only space aboard where a genuine fire burned, carefully contained within an iron stove or firebox, designed to prevent the flames from ever touching the surrounding wood. Crew members off duty might linger near the galley longer than strictly necessary, drawn by its warmth, the way anyone might gravitate toward a fireplace on a cold evening, trading quiet conversation or simply sitting in companionable silence, absorbing whatever heat radiated outward before eventually returning to the cooler air of the crew's quarters. Food, though rarely luxurious, offered its own small comforts, particularly when a hot meal could be managed despite rough seas or limited supplies. We'll spend more time on the specifics of shipboard diet shortly, but it's worth noting here simply that the psychological comfort of warm food, however plain, however repetitive, mattered enormously to sailors enduring long, cold, difficult voyages. A hot meal signalled in some small way that things were still functioning normally, that the ship's routines were holding even as the ocean outside did its best to disrupt them. Rum, or other spirits, when rum wasn't available, played a genuine role in shipboard comfort as well. And it's worth discussing honestly rather than romantically, Alcohol rations were common aboard many ships of this era, partly because fresh water stored in wooden casks for long periods tended to grow foul and unsafe to drink, while alcohol, added to water or consumed on its own, helped mask unpleasant tastes and offered some protection against the bacteria that could otherwise cause illness. Beyond its practical uses, a modest ration of rum at the end of a hard day's work, or after a particularly difficult watch in freezing wind, offered something sailors genuinely valued. A small, reliable pleasure in an otherwise unpredictable life, a brief warmth spreading through a tired body, and a moment of shared ritual among crew members who had few other rituals to hold on to. Beyond these physical comforts, superstition played a remarkably important role in how sailors made sense of and found some measure of peace with the genuine dangers surrounding them every single day. The sea, after all, was profoundly unpredictable even to experienced sailors, and human beings have always found ways to create a sense of control, or at least the comforting illusion of it, when facing forces genuinely beyond their understanding or influence. Certain practices became widespread across sailing communities, pirate crews included. Whistling aboard a ship, for instance, was widely considered to be an invitation to bad weather, a superstition serious enough that a sailor caught whistling carelessly might find themselves genuinely reprimanded by crewmates who took the belief seriously. Certain words, too, were avoided, particularly aboard ship, out of a belief that speaking them aloud might somehow summon misfortune. Small charms or talismans, sometimes religious in nature, sometimes rooted in older folk traditions, carried from a sailor's homeland, were tucked into pockets or worn close to the body, carried not necessarily out of deep conviction, but out of the simple, understandable human impulse to hold on to something, anything, that might offer protection when so much of daily life felt entirely outside anyone's control. Certain rituals became attached specifically to sleep and rest as well. Some sailors developed personal habits before settling into their hammocks each night, a particular way of arranging their belongings, a quiet phrase spoken under their breath, a small routine repeated with enough consistency that it became, in its own way, a kind of psychological signal to the body that the day's dangers were, for now, being set aside. These small rituals, whatever specific form they took, likely served a genuine psychological purpose beyond mere superstition, offering sailors a sense of structure and predictability within lives that otherwise offered very little of either. And then there was, simply, the comfort of companionship itself, which deserves to be named, honestly, as one of the most significant comforts available to any pirate crew. Living in such close quarters, sharing such consistent danger and hardship, crews develop bonds that, while not always free of tension or conflict, nonetheless provided genuine emotional support through difficult stretches of a voyage. Knowing that the person swinging in the hammock beside you had faced the same storms, endured the same cold, eaten the same monotonous meals, and would likely face tomorrow's dangers alongside you as well, created a kind of unspoken solidarity that made the hardships of shipboard life more bearable, even when it couldn't make them disappear entirely. It's worth sitting with this thought for a moment as we drift further into the night ourselves. That comfort, real comfort, doesn't always require luxury or ease. Sometimes it simply requires a small, steady light in the dark, a warm meal shared with others, a quiet ritual repeated with enough consistency to feel dependable, and the simple, profound reassurance of not facing hardship entirely alone. The pirates crossing those cold, stormy waters centuries ago understood this instinctively, even if they never would have described it in quite these terms, and there's something worth carrying with us even now in how they manage to find rest and comfort within genuinely difficult circumstances, night after night, for as long as each voyage required. No account of shipboard life would be complete without spending time on food, because what pirates ate and how shaped nearly every other aspect of their daily routine, including, in meaningful ways, how well they slept. Hunger, after all, makes for a restless companion in the dark, and a crew that ate reasonably well even by the modest standards of the age of sail was a crew far more likely to find genuine rest at the end of a long day. The foundation of shipboard diet during this era was, without much competition, hardtack, a simple biscuit made from flour, water, and sometimes a small amount of salt. Baked until it became hard enough to survive months of storage without spoiling, hardtack was not, by any reasonable measure, delicious. It was dense, dry, and famously difficult to eat without first softening it, whether by dunking it in tea, coffee, or whatever liquid happened to be available, or simply by allowing enough saliva to gradually work through its considerable toughness. Sailors developed their own techniques and small jokes around this humble staple, and hardtack, monotonous as it was, provided reliable, long-lasting calories that could survive the punishing conditions of a long sea voyage without rotting, something that mattered enormously given how limited proper food storage was aboard a wooden ship. Salted meat formed the other major pillar of shipboard diet, typically beef or pork that had been preserved through heavy salting, a process that allowed meat to survive for extended periods without refrigeration, which of course did not exist. This salted meat required soaking before cooking to draw out some of the overwhelming salt content, and even then it remained tough, heavily flavoured, and a far cry from fresh meat prepared on land. Still, it provided crucial protein for a crew engaged in physically demanding labour day after day, and a pot of salted meat stewed slowly with whatever vegetables or grains happened to be available formed the backbone of many shipboard meals. Dried peas, beans, and other legumes supplemented this diet when available, providing additional protein and helping to stretch limited supplies across a long voyage. These would typically be boiled into a thick stew or pottage, often combined with whatever salted meat was on hand, creating a filling, if a repetitive, meal that could be prepared in relatively large quantities, using the ship's single galley fire. Fresh food, when it could be obtained, was treasured accordingly. Ships would take on fresh provisions whenever they made port, fruit, vegetables, and occasionally live animals such as chickens or goats, which would be kept aboard and slaughtered gradually over the following weeks as fresh meat ran out. This fresh food served a purpose beyond simple variety in an otherwise monotonous diet. Sailors of this era, though they didn't fully understand the underlying science, had learned through hard experience that extended voyages without fresh food led to a debilitating illness we now know as scurvy, caused by a deficiency in vitamin C. Citrus fruits, when available, were particularly valued for their apparent ability to prevent this illness, though the full scientific understanding of why this worked wouldn't develop until considerably later. Cooking aboard ship presented its own unique challenges, given the very real danger of open flame on a wooden vessel constantly in motion. The galley, positioned carefully to minimize fire risk, typically contained a brick or iron firebox designed to contain flames safely, allowing the ship's cook a role that carried genuine importance despite its relatively humble status, to prepare meals for the entire crew using a single, carefully managed cooking fire. During rough weather, cooking became considerably more difficult or was sometimes suspended entirely, meaning that crews riding out a significant storm might find themselves relying on cold rations, hardtack, and whatever preserved food required no preparation until conditions calmed enough to safely relight the galley fire. Freshwater, perhaps surprisingly, presented one of the most persistent challenges of shipboard life, despite being surrounded on all sides by water that was, of course, entirely undrinkable due to its salt content. Fresh water was stored in large wooden casks, and despite best efforts, this stored water tended to grow increasingly foul over the course of a long voyage, developing an unpleasant taste and sometimes harboring bacteria that could cause illness. This is part of why alcohol played such a practical role aboard ship, not merely as a pleasant indulgence, but as a genuine method of making otherwise questionable water safer and more palatable to drink. Meals themselves, simple as they were, provided important structure to the shipboard day, marking the passage of time in a life that otherwise offered relatively few clear markers beyond the rotation of watches and the movement of the sun and stars. Crew members would typically gather for meals in shifts, given the limited space available, and these shared meals, however plain the food itself might be, offered a valuable social function. A brief pause in the day's labour where crew members could talk, joke, complain about the weather, or simply sit together in shared, quiet companionship. There's something worth noting in how this simple, repetitive diet, hardtack and salted meat and the occasional treasured piece of fresh fruit actually supported the broader rhythm of rest and recovery aboard ship. A full belly, even one filled with fairly plain food, contributes genuinely to a body's ability to find sleep and recover from the physical demands of shipboard labour. Sailors who had eaten adequately, even if not luxuriously, were sailors far more likely to settle comfortably into their swaying hammocks at the end of a long day, their bodies satisfied enough to allow the mind to finally, gradually, let go of the day's concerns and drift toward rest. And so, as the ship's cook banked the galley fire for the night, and the last of the evening meal was cleared away, the crew would begin their gradual descent towards sleep, bellies reasonably full, the taste of salt and simple grain still lingering ready now to face whatever the night and the sea had waiting for them. Beyond the practical mechanics of hammocks and watches, storms and meals, there existed a quieter, more personal layer to how pirates prepared themselves for sleep each night, a collection of small habits and rituals that, while rarely recorded in official ship logs or historical documents, likely played just as significant a role in helping exhausted sailors find genuine rest amid genuinely difficult circumstances. Consider first the simple act of settling into a hammock itself, a small skill that every sailor eventually mastered through repeated, sometimes clumsy, practice. New sailors, unfamiliar with the particular technique required, often found themselves unceremoniously dumped onto the deck below during their early attempts. much to the amusement of more experienced crewmates who had, of course, endured the very same embarrassment themselves when they were new to shipboard life. Climbing into a hammock correctly required a certain confident, practiced motion, swinging one leg over while maintaining balance, allowing the fabric to accept and cradle the body's weight gradually rather than all at once. Once mastered, this became second nature, an automatic motion requiring no conscious thought, performed identically whether the sea was calm or genuinely rough. Many sailors developed personal habits around how they arranged themselves within their hammock each night, a preferred position, a particular way of tucking a blanket, perhaps a small personal item kept close, a carved token, a letter from home carefully wrapped to protect it from damp, a small religious medallion. These items, modest as they were, provided a kind of psychological anchor, a small piece of continuity and personal identity within lives that otherwise offered very little privacy or individual space. In a world where a sailor's entire visible possessions might fit within a single sea chest, these small personal items carried outsized emotional significance. Prayer, too, played a role for many sailors, regardless of their particular faith or how devoutly they practiced it during ordinary daily life. The genuine, ever-present dangers of life at sea, storms, disease, violence, the simple unpredictability of the ocean itself led many sailors toward at least occasional private prayer or reflection before settling into sleep each night. This wasn't necessarily formal or elaborate. Often it took the form of a few quiet, private words, spoken silently or under one's breath. A brief acknowledgement of the day's dangers survived, and a quiet hope extended toward whatever the following day might bring. Whether or not these prayers reflected deep personal conviction, they likely served a genuine psychological purpose, offering sailors a moment of quiet reflection and acceptance before allowing themselves to fully relax into rest. The transition from the ship's daytime bustle to its nighttime quiet followed its own gradual rhythm as well, one that developed naturally aboard most vessels regardless of formal ship's orders. As the evening meal concluded and the day's major tasks wound down, conversation among the crew would typically shift in tone, growing quieter, more relaxed, often turning toward storytelling, a practice that served both entertainment and genuine social bonding purposes. Sailors, drawing from vast collective experience across many voyages and many different ships, developed rich oral traditions, tales of previous journeys, close encounters with danger survived, ports visited, and characters encountered along the way. These stories, told and retold, refined through repeated telling until they took on almost ritualistic qualities, provided a gentle, familiar transition from the day's labor toward the quiet of night. A shared experience that bound the crew together, even as individual sailors gradually drifted off mid-story, lulled by both the familiar tale and the gentle rocking of their hammocks. Music, too, played a role in this nightly transition for many crews. A sailor with any musical skill, whether playing a simple stringed instrument, a small drum, or simply possessing a strong singing voice, was genuinely valued aboard ship, providing entertainment that helped fill the long, monotonous hours of a lengthy voyage. Sea shanties, rhythmic work songs originally developed to coordinate physical labor, such as hauling rope or raising anchor, sometimes transitioned in the evening hours into gentler, more melodic songs, ballads of home, of lost loves, of distant lands, sung quietly enough not to disturb those already drifting towards sleep, yet present enough to provide a final, comforting layer of sound as the ship settled into its nighttime rhythm. There's a particular image worth holding on to here as we drift further into this quiet exploration of pirate life. The lower deck of a ship, lit by the warm, flickering glow of a few careful lanterns, filled with the low murmur of storytelling voices gradually softening, perhaps the gentle sound of a quiet song drifting through the cramped space, the creak of timber and the distant rush of waves providing a constant familiar backdrop, while all around sailors settle one by one into their swaying hammocks, the day's dangers and labours finally set aside, if only for a few precious hours. This nightly ritual, repeated with remarkable consistency across countless ships and countless voyages throughout the age of sail, represents something genuinely worth appreciating. The simple, universal human need to create structure, comfort, and connection even within genuinely difficult circumstances. Pirates, despite their fearsome historical reputation, were, in these quiet nighttime hours, simply people, tired from a long day's labour, seeking the same basic comforts anyone might seek: a familiar routine, a moment of quiet reflection, the sound of a friendly voice or a gentle song before finally allowing themselves to rest. And as the last quiet conversations faded and the final lanterns were dimmed to their lowest, safest flame, the ship would settle into something approaching true nighttime quiet, disturbed only by the ever-present creak of timber, the distant rush of water against the hull, and the occasional soft footsteps of the watch crew moving carefully overhead, maintaining their vigilant rotation through the dark hours, while their crewmates, finally, found their way into genuine rest. Sleep aboard a pirate ship was not always a matter of simple exhaustion giving way to rest. For sailors dealing with injury or illness, both distressingly common aboard vessels where medical knowledge remained limited and conditions were rarely sanitary, the nights could take on an entirely different character, one worth understanding if we're to appreciate the full reality of shipboard life during this era. Injuries were an unfortunate, near-constant feature of life at sea, arising from the physically demanding nature of shipboard labour. Sailors climbing through rigging high above the deck risked serious falls, particularly during rough weather, when the ship's motion made every movement more treacherous. Heavy equipment, ropes, blocks, cannon and cargo all posed genuine risk of crushing or otherwise injuring careless or simply unlucky crew members. And of course, for pirate crews specifically, violence itself, whether from boarding actions, ship-to-ship combat, or internal disputes, added another layer of physical risk beyond the ordinary dangers of maritime labour. Medical care aboard most ships of this era was rudimentary at best, often provided by a ship's surgeon, whose actual medical training might range from genuinely skilled to alarmingly minimal. Common treatments included bloodletting, still widely practiced despite its limited actual medical benefit, along with various herbal remedies, some genuinely useful and others rooted more in tradition and hope than in any real medicinal effect. For serious injuries, particularly those involving broken bones or deep wounds, treatment could be genuinely painful, performed without the benefit of modern anesthesia, relying instead on whatever alcohol happened to be available to dull the sharpest edges of the pain. For a sailor recovering from injury or illness, sleep took on a different, more complicated character than the ordinary rest sought by their healthy crewmates. Pain, of course, made comfortable rest considerably more difficult, and the ship's constant motion, which under normal circumstances provided the gentle, soothing rock that helped sailors drift towards sleep, could become genuinely uncomfortable or even painful for someone nursing a broken bone or serious wound. Crewmates often took on informal caregiving roles during these periods, adjusting an injured sailor's hammock to minimize discomfort, bringing food and water when the injured party couldn't easily move to retrieve it themselves, and providing the kind of basic companionship and support that, even without sophisticated medical knowledge, likely made a genuine difference in recovery. Illness presented its own particular challenges, and disease spread relatively easily within the cramped, poorly ventilated conditions of shipboard life. Common ailments included various fevers, respiratory illnesses exacerbated by damp conditions and constant exposure to cold, wet weather, and, of course, the aforementioned scurvy on longer voyages where fresh food ran short. For a sailor dealing with fever or serious illness, the already difficult conditions of shipboard sleep became considerably more challenging. The cramped, warm, poorly ventilated lower deck, offering little relief for someone already struggling with their body's own internal battle against infection. And yet, even within these difficult circumstances, certain small comforts persisted. A sick or injured sailor might be given a slightly more favourable position within the crowded lower deck, perhaps closer to whatever ventilation existed, or further from the particular dampness of certain areas prone to collecting moisture. Crewmates, despite the genuine hardships of their own daily lives, often demonstrated real generosity towards sick or injured companions, sharing rations, offering their own blankets, or simply providing the quiet companionship of sitting nearby during difficult nights. This mutual support reveals something worth sitting with as we continue our slow journey through this history, that the harsh, dangerous conditions of pirate life, rather than eroding basic human compassion, often seemed to reinforce it. Crews who depended entirely on one another for survival, who shared every hardship of storm and cold and hunger together, developed genuine bonds of loyalty and care that extended naturally into moments of individual crisis. A sailor recovering from a serious injury was not left to face those difficult nights entirely alone, but was, in whatever limited ways the ship's harsh conditions allowed, supported and cared for by companions who understood all too well that their own turn for such care might come at any point during the long, unpredictable voyage ahead. Recovery itself, when it came, followed its own gradual rhythm, matching in some ways the broader rhythms of shipboard life we've already explored. A sailor healing from injury would gradually return to normal duties as strength allowed, perhaps taking on lighter tasks initially before eventually rejoining the full rotation of watches and physical labour that defined ordinary shipboard routine. And with this gradual return to normal activity came naturally a return to more normal patterns of sleep as well, the particular discomforts of injury or illness fading as the body healed, allowing the familiar gentle rock of the hammock to once again provide its accustomed comfort rather than an additional source of discomfort to be endured. There's a quiet resilience worth appreciating in all of this, a reminder that even within circumstances we might consider genuinely harsh, by modern standards, limited medical knowledge, painful treatments, cramped and unsanitary conditions, human beings found ways to care for one another, to endure difficult nights, and to eventually recover and return to whatever rhythm of rest and labour defined their particular circumstances. The sailors who lived through these experiences didn't have the luxury of modern medicine or genuinely comfortable recovery conditions, but they had each other, and within the limits of what that companionship could provide, they managed more often than not to endure. There is a particular quality to the first light of morning after a difficult night at sea, a quality that sailors across every era of maritime history have described with something approaching genuine reverence. After hours of darkness, of howling wind and crashing waves, of the ship's timbers groaning under stress, and the crew's nerves stretched thin by uncertainty, the gradual arrival of dawn brings with it something that feels, in the moment, almost miraculous. Proof that the ship has survived, that the crew has survived, and that whatever the sea had intended to throw at them during the long hours of darkness, they had once again managed to weather it. This transition from storm to calm rarely happened instantly. More often it unfolded gradually, the wind's fierce howl slowly softening into something more manageable, the waves' violent crashing gradually settling into a steadier, more predictable rhythm, and the sky itself, which had been an unbroken mass of dark, churning cloud, through the worst of the night, beginning to show the first faint hints of grey, then gold, along the eastern horizon, as the sun prepared to rise on a world that, despite everything, remained essentially unchanged. Below deck, this transition would often be sensed before it was fully understood. The ship's motion, still present but no longer violent, would settle into a gentler, more familiar rhythm, the kind of steady rocking that sailors had long since learned to associate with genuine rest rather than anxious vigilance. Crew members who had spent the night lying awake in their hammocks, listening tensely to the chaos above, might finally, gradually, allow themselves to relax, their bodies slowly releasing the tension they'd been unconsciously holding through the long hours of uncertainty. As dawn fully broke, the crew would begin the familiar process of assessing the night's damage and returning the ship to its normal working order. Sails, which had been reduced or entirely furled during the height of the storm, would need to be reset to catch the wind properly once again. Any damage to rigging, deck fittings, or the ship structure itself would need careful inspection, and necessary repairs would begin, often occupying much of the crew's attention throughout the following day. Cargo and supplies that had shifted, despite careful securing, would need to be reorganized and properly restowed. And the crew themselves, having endured a genuinely difficult night, would gradually emerge from below deck into the fresh morning air, many of them likely pausing simply to breathe deeply, to feel the relief of open sky and calmer seas after so many hours confined below in cramped, anxious darkness. There's something worth appreciating in how quickly, despite the genuine difficulty of the night just past, shipboard life would return to its familiar routines. Breakfast would be prepared, whatever simple fare the ship's stores allowed, and the crew would gather, perhaps a bit more subdued than usual, perhaps sharing quiet observations about just how bad the previous night had actually been, before gradually settling back into the ordinary rhythm of watches, labour, and rest that defined shipboard life during calmer stretches of a voyage. This return to routine after crisis reveals something genuinely important about how sailors of this era managed to endure the profound uncertainty and danger inherent in their chosen way of life. Rather than dwelling extensively on the fear and difficulty of a stormy night, crews seem to develop a kind of practical resilience, acknowledging the danger honestly, while nonetheless returning as quickly as circumstances allowed to the familiar structure of daily shipboard routine. This wasn't necessarily a conscious psychological strategy in the way we might describe it today, but rather a practical necessity born from the simple reality that a ship and its crew needed to keep functioning regardless of what the previous night had brought. And so, as the sun rose fully over calmer waters and the ship settled back into its familiar daytime rhythm of labour and duty, the memory of the storm would gradually recede into simply another story to be told during future evening gatherings below deck. Another shared experience adding to the crew's collective history and their growing sense of having weathered genuine hardship together and emerged, if not entirely unscathed, at least intact. The following night, assuming calmer weather held, would bring a return to the familiar comfort of ordinary shipboard sleep, hammocks swinging gently rather than violently, watch rotations proceeding according to their normal schedule rather than the heightened vigilance a storm demanded, and the crew settling into rest with perhaps a slightly deeper appreciation for the simple comfort of an uneventful night, however modest that comfort might have seemed under ordinary circumstances. This cyclical rhythm, danger followed by relief, storm followed by calm, difficult nights, followed eventually by easier ones, defined much of the emotional and psychological experience of life at sea during the age of sail. And there's something worth holding on to as we ourselves drift further into this quiet exploration of history, in how sailors of this era managed to find genuine peace and rest even within lives defined by such profound and constant uncertainty. They could not control the weather, could not guarantee calm seas or easy voyages, could not eliminate the genuine dangers inherent in their chosen way of life. But within whatever circumstances each particular night presented, they found ways to rest, to recover, and to prepare themselves for whatever the following day and the following night might bring. And so the ship sailed on through calm nights and stormy ones alike, its crew finding their rhythm of rest and labour amid the endless, restless rock of the open sea. And still, the ship rocked on. Continue with the final 5, architected narrative arc from nightmares through storm to dawn, resolution, architected narrative arc from nightmares through storm to dawn resolution. For all the practical comforts pirates managed to build into their nightly routine, the hammocks, the shared warmth, the small rituals of prayer and storytelling, it would be dishonest to suggest that sleep at sea was ever entirely free from fear. The ocean, after all, gave sailors countless reasons to feel afraid, and those fears, however carefully managed during the busy hours of daylight labour, often found their way below deck each night, settling quietly alongside exhausted crew members as they tried to close their eyes. Some of these fears were entirely practical and grounded in genuine, immediate danger. The possibility of encountering a hostile vessel, whether a naval ship hunting pirates specifically or simply another crew looking for easy prey, remained a constant undercurrent of shipboard life. A sailor drifting towards sleep might find their mind returning almost involuntarily to the question of what would happen if the watch above suddenly called out a warning, if the quiet rhythm of an ordinary night were shattered by the sudden urgent need to prepare for battle. This wasn't idle anxiety. Pirate crews lived under genuine, persistent risk of violent confrontation, and the awareness of that risk didn't simply disappear because the sun had gone down. Beyond the threat of other ships, there existed the deeper, more elemental fear of the sea itself, a fear that predates recorded history and remains, in some form, familiar to anyone who has ever found themselves on open water, far from any visible shore. The ocean's sheer scale, its genuine indifference to human survival, its capacity to shift without warning from calm to catastrophic, all of this created a kind of background anxiety that sailors learned to live alongside rather than ever fully overcome. Even experienced crew members who had weathered dozens of storms and crossed thousands of miles of open water likely never entirely lost that small, persistent awareness of just how vulnerable their wooden vessel actually was against the genuine power of the sea. This is, in part, why superstition played such a significant role in shipboard culture, as we touched on earlier. Superstitious practices, whatever their actual effectiveness, provided sailors with a psychological framework for managing genuine, otherwise unmanageable fear. Believing that certain actions might bring good fortune or that avoiding certain words might prevent misfortune offered a small, comforting sense of agency within circumstances that were, in reality, almost entirely beyond any individual sailor's control. Ghost stories and maritime legends served a similar psychological function, though perhaps in a less obvious way. Sailors of this era shared countless tales of phantom ships, cursed vessels, and the restless spirits of sailors lost at sea, stories that might seem, on the surface, designed purely to frighten. But there's a case to be made that these stories actually served a subtly comforting purpose, transforming vague, unnamed anxiety about the ocean's genuine dangers into specific narrative form. A named fear, however frightening its details, can feel more manageable than an unnamed one, and the shared experience of telling and hearing these stories together in the flickering lantern light of the lower deck likely provided a kind of communal processing of the genuine fears every sailor privately carried. There's also something worth noting about how fear itself changed in character depending on a sailor's experience level. Newer crew members, unfamiliar with the ship's particular sounds and movements, often struggled considerably more with anxiety during their early voyages, startled by creaks and groans that experienced sailors had long since learned to recognize as entirely normal. Over time, as a sailor accumulated genuine experience, this anxiety generally softened, not because the underlying dangers had actually decreased, but because familiarity allowed the mind to distinguish more accurately between ordinary shipboard sounds and genuine cause for alarm. This process of gradually learning to distinguish normal danger from immediate threat represents one of the quieter, less dramatic forms of resilience that pirate crews developed over time. A veteran sailor, lying in their hammock during an ordinary rough night, could generally distinguish between the sounds of a manageable storm and something genuinely more dangerous, allowing them to rest with reasonable confidence, even amid conditions that might have kept a newer crew member awake with anxious uncertainty. This wasn't recklessness or a lack of appropriate caution. Rather, it reflected a genuinely earned, hard-won familiarity with the ship and the sea that allowed experienced sailors to calibrate their fear more accurately to actual rather than imagined danger. And yet, even for the most experienced sailors, certain fears likely never fully disappeared. The knowledge that a sudden catastrophic storm could arise with relatively little warning, that a single moment of bad luck or poor judgment could end in genuine tragedy, remained a persistent undercurrent throughout even the calmest stretches of shipboard life. Sailors managed this not by eliminating fear entirely, an impossible task given the genuine risks of their chosen life, but by developing practical strategies for living alongside it. The rituals, the shared stories, the mutual support of crewmates, the simple, hard-won trust in a ship and crew that had proven themselves capable of weathering previous dangers. There's a particular kind of courage worth recognizing in this, a courage that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply persists, night after night, in the quiet decision to close one's eyes and allow oneself to rest, despite genuine unresolved uncertainty about what tomorrow might bring. The pirates crossing those cold, stormy waters centuries ago carried real fears with them into every night's sleep, fears of violence, of storms, of the vast, indifferent power of the ocean itself. And yet, night after night, they found their way into rest anyway, not because the fear had disappeared, but because they had learned gradually and through hard experience how to carry it alongside them, without letting it prevent the rest their bodies genuinely needed. If we were to distill the experience of sleeping aboard a pirate ship down to its purest sensory essence, stripped of narrative and history, we would arrive at sound. More than sight, more than touch, sound defined the nighttime experience of shipboard life, a constant layered symphony that sailors learned to interpret with remarkable precision, distinguishing danger from safety, calm from crisis, almost entirely through careful, practiced listening. Let's spend some time here in this quiet chapter simply sitting with those sounds, because there's something genuinely soothing in understanding them fully, in the same way that understanding any complex, layered soundscape, rainfall, distant thunder, a crackling fire, tends to deepen our appreciation for its particular characteristic piece. The foundation of shipboard sound, the constant baseline against which every other noise registered, was the ship's timber itself. Wood, under the constant stress of a vessel moving through water, produces an almost endless variety of sounds, creaks and groans and subtle pops, as different sections of the hull flexed and adjusted to the ship's movement. Experienced sailors developed an almost unconscious familiarity with their particular ship's characteristic sounds, learning to distinguish the ordinary, expected creaking of a vessel under normal sail from the sharper, more concerning sounds that might indicate genuine structural stress. This wasn't a skill anyone consciously studied. It developed gradually, through months and years of simply living within a ship's particular acoustic signature, until the sounds became so familiar they faded into comfortable background noise, noticed mainly in their absence or in any unexpected variation. Layered atop this constant timber creaking was the sound of water itself, in its many forms. The steady rush of water along the hull as the ship moved forward through calm seas produced a continuous, almost meditative sound, not unlike distant, steady rainfall. During rougher conditions, this transformed into something more dramatic, the repeated crash of waves against the hull, sometimes gentle and rhythmic, sometimes sharp and sudden depending on sea conditions, and always beneath these more prominent sounds existed the general ambient presence of the ocean itself, an enormous, restless body of water surrounding the ship on every side, its presence felt as much as heard, a kind of constant, deep awareness that shaped every other sound aboard the vessel. Wind, too, played its own significant role in the ship's nighttime soundscape, particularly as it moved through the rigging high above the deck. On calm nights, this might produce only a gentle occasional whisper as air moved through ropes and sails. During rougher weather, this transformed dramatically into a genuine howl, wind screaming through taut rigging with an intensity that could be genuinely unsettling to anyone unfamiliar with the sound, though experienced sailors learned to gauge storm severity partly through careful attention to exactly this particular quality of sound. Beneath these larger, more dramatic sounds of ship and sea existed the quieter, more intimate soundscape of the crew itself, sleeping together in the crowded lower deck. Breathing, in its many varieties, deep and slow from those already fully asleep, lighter and more irregular from those still drifting toward rest, formed a constant, gentle undercurrent throughout the space. Snoring, inevitable given the number of bodies crowded together, added its own particular texture to the nighttime soundscape, sometimes a source of genuine irritation to light sleepers, but more often simply absorbed into the overall ambient noise of a resting crew. Occasional shifts and adjustments within hammocks, the soft creak of rope against the overhead beams as sailors turned or resettled themselves, added further texture to this intimate, close soundscape. And periodically, cutting through this layered nighttime quiet, came the sounds of the watch itself, footsteps moving carefully across the deck above, occasionally a quiet exchange of words between crew members on duty, the distant, muffled sound of activity happening just beyond the immediate awareness of those resting below. These sounds, rather than disturbing sleep, likely provided their own subtle reassurance, quiet proof that someone remained alert and watchful, even while the rest of the crew rested, a kind of auditory confirmation that the ship's essential systems continued functioning properly, even in the depths of night. There's something worth appreciating in how this entire complex soundscape, timber and water and wind and breath, worked together to create something that, despite its genuine complexity, ultimately supported rather than prevented rest. The human mind, it turns out, adapts remarkably well to consistent, predictable patterns of sound, even complex and layered ones, gradually incorporating them into the background rather than treating them as sources of ongoing alarm. Sailors who had spent enough time aboard a particular vessel developed genuine familiarity with its complete acoustic signature, allowing them to rest peacefully amid a soundscape that might have seemed genuinely overwhelming to an outside observer encountering it for the first time. This process of acoustic adaptation offers perhaps a small but genuine insight into how humans manage to find rest even within objectively challenging circumstances. It's not that the sounds themselves became quieter or less complex over time. Rather, the mind learned gradually and through repeated exposure to interpret this particular combination of sounds as safe, familiar, and ultimately conducive to rest, rather than alarming. The creak of timber, the rush of water, the distant howl of wind through rigging, these sounds that might keep an unfamiliar listener anxiously awake, became, for experienced sailors, something closer to a genuine lullaby, a complex, ever-present reminder that their ship continued its steady journey through the dark water, carrying them safely onward through whatever the night might bring. Let's slow down now and follow one particular night through to its end, not as a general description of shipboard routine, but as a single, specific example, the kind of night countless pirate crews likely experienced in some variation, across countless voyages throughout the age of sail. The day had been ordinary enough, the ship maintaining a steady westward course under moderate winds, the crew moving through their familiar rotation of labour and rest, without any particular incident worth remarking upon. As afternoon gave way to evening, however, the sky along the western horizon began taking on a particular quality that experienced crew members recognised immediately. A deepening grey, heavy and low, moving steadily closer with each passing hour. The captain, consulting quietly with the ship's more experienced sailors, made the decision well before the storm's actual arrival to begin preparations. This timing mattered enormously. Storms that caught a crew unprepared posed far greater danger than those met with adequate preparation time. Sail was reduced gradually as the afternoon progressed, canvas gathered and secured section by section as the approaching weather made its intentions increasingly clear. By the time the evening meal was served, a modest portion of salted meat and hardtack, eaten more quickly than usual given the mounting sense of urgency. The wind had picked up noticeably, and the first scattered drops of rain had begun striking the deck. Crew members not immediately needed for storm preparation began making their way below, securing personal belongings and settling into their hammocks earlier than the ordinary evening routine typically allowed, sensing correctly that this particular night would demand whatever rest they could manage to gather before conditions worsened significantly. As full darkness settled over the ship, the storm arrived in earnest. The wind, which had been building steadily throughout the evening, transformed into something considerably more forceful, howling through the rigging with an intensity that even experienced sailors found genuinely impressive. Waves, growing steadily larger as the storm intensified, began striking the hull with real force, sending shudders through the ship's entire structure that could be felt distinctly even below deck. Below, in the crowded, lantern-lit space of the lower deck, the crew settled into their hammocks with the particular quality of alertness that distinguished a storm night from an ordinary calm one. Conversation, which under normal circumstances might have continued in quiet, relaxed tones well into the evening, grew notably sparser, most crew members choosing instead to lie quietly, listening to the mounting chaos above, their hammocks beginning to swing with increasing amplitude as the ship's motion intensified. One younger crew member, still relatively new to shipboard life and not yet fully accustomed to genuinely severe weather, found himself struggling considerably with the mounting anxiety the storm's intensity provoked. An older, more experienced sailor nearby, noticing this distress despite the dim lighting, offered quiet reassurance, explaining in a calm, unhurried voice that the ship had weathered considerably worse conditions before, that the particular quality of sound currently filling the space, while genuinely dramatic, actually indicated a fairly ordinary, manageable storm rather than anything approaching genuine catastrophe. This small act of reassurance, offered without any particular fanfare, likely made a genuine difference, the younger sailor's breathing gradually slowing as he absorbed both the words themselves and the simple, steadying presence of someone who had clearly survived similar nights before. As the storm reached its peak, somewhere in the deepest hours of the night, the ship's motion became genuinely dramatic, hammocks swinging through wide arcs as the vessel pitched and rolled through increasingly severe waves. Sleep, for most of the crew, became largely impossible during this most intense period, replaced instead by a kind of watchful, anxious rest. Eyes closed, but minds remaining alert to every shift in the ship's motion and every variation in the storm's overwhelming sound. And yet, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the intensity began to soften. The wind's howl, which had built to genuinely alarming levels, began losing some of its sharpest edge. The waves, while still substantial, began striking with somewhat less violent force. The ship's motion, still considerable, began settling into something closer to the ship's ordinary, more manageable rolling rhythm. By the time the first grey hints of dawn began showing through whatever small gaps existed around the ship's sealed hatches, the worst of the storm had genuinely passed. Exhausted crew members, many of whom had managed only fragmented, anxious rest throughout the night's most intense hours, finally began drifting into deeper, more genuine sleep as the ship's motion settled into calmer patterns, their bodies finally able to release the tension they'd been holding through the long night's uncertainty. And so, as morning light gradually strengthened outside, most of the crew slept on for a few final, precious hours, their hammocks now swinging gently rather than violently. The storm's genuine danger having passed into simply another shared story to be told during future evening gatherings, another night successfully weathered together. There's a particular kind of closeness that develops between people who have shared genuine hardship together and pirate crews, living through countless nights of storm and cold and uncertainty side by side, developed exactly this kind of deep, hard-won companionship, bonds that shaped nearly every aspect of shipboard life, including, in meaningful ways, how well individual sailors managed to find rest. This closeness wasn't necessarily comfortable in any conventional sense. Living in such cramped quarters, sharing such limited privacy, crew members inevitably learn things about one another that might, under different circumstances, have remained private. Fears voiced quietly during difficult nights, small personal habits and rituals, the particular sound of someone's breathing as they drifted towards sleep. This enforced intimacy, while occasionally a source of friction, more often produced genuine understanding and mutual support, crew members developing an almost instinctive awareness of one another's needs and moods. Consider, for instance, how crews naturally developed informal systems of mutual care that extended well beyond the ship's official structure of watches and duties. A crew member struggling with homesickness or anxiety might find themselves quietly comforted by a companion who recognized the particular signs of that struggle, having likely experienced something similar themselves at some earlier point in their own maritime career. Someone dealing with the aftermath of injury or illness could generally count on genuine support from crewmates. whether through practical help with daily tasks or simply the comfort of companionship during difficult recovery periods. This mutual support extended naturally into the shared rituals we've already explored, the storytelling, the music, the quiet camaraderie of shared meals. These weren't formally organized activities, but rather organic expressions of genuine connection between people who depended entirely on one another for survival within a genuinely dangerous, unpredictable environment. A crew that had developed strong bonds of mutual trust and support was, in very practical terms, a crew better equipped to handle the genuine challenges of shipboard life, working together more effectively during moments of crisis and providing one another with the emotional support necessary to endure the countless smaller hardships of daily maritime existence. There's something worth noting, too, about how this closeness developed specifically through shared experience of difficult nights. The storms weathered together, the cold endured collectively, the fears quietly shared and mutually acknowledged in the dim lantern light of the lower deck. These weren't experiences that could be replicated through ordinary daytime interaction alone. There was something particular about the vulnerability of nighttime, of lying together in the dark, exhausted and sometimes afraid, that seemed to deepen bonds in ways that daylight, labor, and interaction, however cooperative, simply couldn't quite match. This pattern extended even into how crews handled loss, an unfortunately common feature of shipboard life given the genuine dangers of maritime existence during this era. When a crew member died, whether through illness, injury, violence, or simply the accumulated toll of a genuinely difficult life, the response among remaining crew members typically reflected the deep bonds that had developed through shared hardship. Grief, while rarely discussed extensively in the kind of formal historical records that survive from this period, likely played a genuine role in shipboard emotional life, crews finding ways to honor and remember lost companions even within the practical constraints of continuing their voyage. It's worth pausing here to consider what this tells us about human resilience more broadly. Pirate crews existed within circumstances that, by almost any modern measure, would be considered genuinely harsh: cramped quarters, limited privacy, persistent physical danger, and the constant underlying uncertainty of life at sea. And yet, within these difficult circumstances, they consistently developed genuine bonds of care, support, and companionship, finding ways to comfort one another through difficult nights, to celebrate small moments of relief and calm, and to face shared dangers with something approaching genuine, collective courage. This deep companionship, more than any particular physical comfort or practical innovation, may represent the most significant factor in how pirate crews managed to find genuine rest, despite the countless challenges of their chosen way of life. A hammock provided physical comfort, a watch system provided practical safety, but it was ultimately the simple, profound reassurance of shared human connection, of knowing that the person swinging gently in the next hammock had faced the same storms and shared the same fears, and would, in all likelihood, face whatever tomorrow brought right alongside you, that allowed exhausted, sometimes frightened sailors to finally close their eyes each night and trust themselves to genuine, restorative sleep. And so, night after night, across countless voyages through cold, uncertain waters, pirate crews found their way into rest, not merely through practical innovation, though that certainly played its part, but through the deeper, quieter comfort of genuine companionship, forged through shared hardship and sustained through countless small acts of mutual care and support, given freely between people who understood, perhaps better than most, just how much such support genuinely mattered. And so we arrive at last, back where we began, standing on the deck of a wooden ship, somewhere in the vast, restless expanse of open ocean, watching as the darkness of another storm-tossed night gradually gives way to the soft, gathering light of dawn. The wind has settled. The waves, so violent and overwhelming just hours before, have softened into something gentler, more manageable, the ship's motion returning to its familiar, steady rhythm, rather than the dramatic pitching and rolling of the night's worst hours. Below deck, the crew stirs gradually, exhausted bodies finally allowing themselves genuine deep rest as the immediate danger recedes, hammocks swinging in slow, peaceful arcs, rather than the wild swings of the storm's peak intensity. The lanterns, burned low through the long night, flicker weakly now, their light gradually becoming less necessary as pale morning sun begins filtering down through whatever small gaps exist in the ship's sealed hatches above. This moment, dawn breaking after a difficult night, represents something worth sitting with as we bring this particular journey to its close. There is a genuine, almost universal human comfort in survival, in simply having made it through whatever difficulty the night presented, and pirate crews, experiencing this particular relief countless times across countless voyages, likely developed a deep, hard-won appreciation for these quiet, morning moments that modern life, with its relative safety and predictability, rarely offers in quite the same intensity. As the ship's day begins properly, the crew emerging gradually from below deck to assess the previous night's impact and resume their ordinary rotation of labour and rest, there's a particular quality to their movements worth noting. Not quite celebration, but something adjacent to it, a quiet, understated relief expressed through small gestures rather than dramatic declaration. A shared glance between crewmates who had weathered the storm together. A brief, tired smile exchanged as sailors pass one another on deck, going about their morning duties. The simple, physical pleasure of fresh air and open sky after hours spent in the cramped, anxious darkness below. And gradually, as the day progresses, the ship's ordinary rhythm reasserts itself. Sails are properly set once again, catching the calmer morning wind. The watch rotation continues, though with somewhat less urgency than the previous night's storm-driven vigilance demanded. Meals are prepared and shared. Stories are told, likely including before long some retelling of the previous night's storm, refined and perhaps slightly embellished with each subsequent telling, becoming part of the crew's shared collective history and mythology. This is perhaps the truest lesson to draw from this long, careful exploration of how pirates managed to sleep through cold, stormy nights at sea. Not that they possessed some remarkable, uncommon courage entirely unavailable to ordinary people, but rather that they developed, through necessity and hard experience, a genuine capacity for resilience built from small, practical elements, a well-designed hammock that turned the ship's violent motion into something closer to a gentle rock, a watch system that ensured someone remained vigilant while others rested, small rituals and comforts, warm food, quiet prayer, shared stories that provided structure and psychological anchor amid genuine uncertainty. And perhaps, most significantly, the deep, hard-won bonds of companionship that developed between people who depended entirely on one another for survival, who shared every hardship of storm and cold and fear, and who found, within that shared vulnerability, genuine comfort and support. None of this made the underlying dangers of pirate life disappear. The storms remained genuinely dangerous. The cold remained genuinely uncomfortable. The persistent uncertainty of life at sea remained a constant undercurrent throughout even the calmest voyages. But within these genuinely difficult circumstances, pirates found ways night after night to rest, to recover, and to prepare themselves for whatever challenges the following day might bring. As our own journey through this history draws to its close, and as the ship in our imagination continues its steady course across calmer waters, sailing on toward whatever destination awaited at the end of this particular voyage, perhaps there's something worth carrying with us into our own rest tonight. The knowledge that comfort doesn't always require ease, that genuine rest can be found even within circumstances that seem, at first glance, entirely incompatible with peace. That the human capacity for resilience, for finding small comforts and deep companionship, even within genuine hardship, remains remarkably consistent across centuries and circumstances entirely different from our own. And still, the ship rocked on, carrying its crew steadily forward through calm water and rough alike, their hammocks swaying gently now in the soft morning light, the storm's memory already settling into simply another shared story, another night successfully weathered together as the vast, endless ocean stretched out ahead of them, carrying whatever the next night and the next storm and the next quiet dawn might bring. Rest well wherever you're listening from tonight. The sea is calm now and the ship sails on.